अते जिसे बूटी लाई हूँ पीर मेरे चुकनी जी ए भी अल्लाह वाले अंदी चुकनी जी ए भी अल्लाह वाले अंदी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming on a pretty cold morning here in New York. We really appreciate you coming by for what we think is going to be a very interesting and compelling program. We're going to be focusing on the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum called APEC, which is a 21-member organization comprised of economies from Asia, Latin America, and North America. And we're not only going to talk about APEC, but we'll also talk about how APEC fits into this larger picture of Asian trade and investment developments. Generally, when people think of APEC, they think of leaders wearing funny shirts. And that does happen on an annual basis. I don't know if it's going to happen this year in Chile, but we'll ask you. But there's a lot more to APEC than that. And I think that is a kind of unfair picture. So before we go further, and I just wanted to share with you what I think are kind of 6 key points on APEC, and I think that will help you be able to follow this program a little better. And they're going to be very simple. Some of you know all this, so for those who do, don't correct me, just listen. First of all, APEC was founded in 1989. But it didn't become an organization that brought leaders together until 1993. And that's when President Clinton invited the other APEC leaders to Blake Island, Washington, many years ago. Were you there then? Or, yeah, Monica was there. It has, as I mentioned, has 21 members. I can't list them all off the top of my head, but there's some surprises in there, both who's in and who's not in. But the United States is in, China is in, Russia joined APEC a number of years ago. It also includes Taiwan and Hong Kong, and it also includes a number of Latin American countries as well. And then what came to a surprise to a lot of people this past year was that Papua New Guinea is part of APEC, and that's where the APEC meetings were last year. Number 3, APEC covers, it really has a broad agenda of issues. Sometimes it's been criticized for trying to do too much. I would kind of say the bread and butter, though, are really their work on trade and investment issues. Fourth, APEC's not a negotiating forum, and anything they agree on, it's non-binding, it's voluntary. And some people, particularly when I worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, used to say, well, if it's not binding, if there's no dispute settlement, what's the worth of working on trade issues in APEC? And to the contrary, I think it offers a really good forum to help bring countries and economies along on emerging issues, getting them comfortable with issues, educating them, agreeing to kind of best practices. And sometimes what we found as trade negotiators, that having done a lot of this work in APEC for a number of years, countries were a lot more comfortable then to go into a trade negotiation and actually agree to binding provisions in these areas. Fifth, there's a really unique role for business in APEC. It has what's called an ABAC. Now someone's going to have to help me. What does that stand for? Business Advisory Council. Okay, the Asian Business Advisory Council. And Phil O'Reilly in our panel, he's one of the New Zealand representatives to ABAC, and I believe Monica is as well. And then sixth, and okay, so that's 5 points, and this is going to be my last point, and this is going to transition to our Chilean friend. Each year in APEC, there's a different host. And so that means a different country or economy is picked to host the event, and they really have not just an event, but a whole series of meetings, and they really have an impact on the agenda. They pick their priorities, and most of the meetings, I think, or in most cases, will be held in that country. I always remember my Asian colleagues were never really thrilled when the meetings took place in Latin America, but I understand there's
We're thrilled.
Yeah, we're thrilled. But I understand there's a direct flight from Wellington to Santiago, so I think that's going to, traffic on that route's going to really go up this year. So this year, Chile will be the host, and I would just say on a personal note, I'd worked at APEC for many years when I was at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the first meeting I ever went to was in 2004, the last time Chile hosted APEC, and it was an incredible meeting, and even at that time, the wine was incredible as well. Okay, so now more into the program. APEC became front and center in 2018 when Papua New Guinea hosted last year, but not necessarily for a good reason. And that's because it was the first time in APEC's history when the leaders were unable to agree to what was called like a joint statement or a joint communique. Typically coming out of these meetings, or until this year, the leaders would describe developments, agree on their aspirations, and put out a statement, and that was not possible this year. When the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea was asked why this wasn't possible, he responded, quote unquote, "You know the two big giants in the room, what can I say?" And he wasn't alone, because most observers attributed the absence of agreement on a joint statement to a manifestation of the trade dispute between the United States and China, the two largest members of APEC, but more importantly, the two largest global economies. And moreover, the speeches of Vice President Pence, who attended for President Trump, and President Xi Jinping to the business leaders at the summit also underscored the growing tension between the United States and China. And here I'm going to quote from Vice President Pence. He said, quote unquote, "Know that the United States offers a better option. We don't drown our partners in a sea of debt. We don't coerce or compromise your independence. The U.S. deals fairly, openly. We do not offer a constricting belt or a one-way road. When you partner with us, we partner with you, and we all prosper." Xi Jinping, not missing a beat, but I understand both of them didn't listen to each other's speeches. Right. But we'll get to that.
Xi's was first. Yeah.
Xi Jinping, okay, his was first, okay. Quote unquote, "Only openness and cooperation can bring more opportunities and create more space for development. This is a well-proven historical fact. One who chooses to close this door will cut himself off from the rest of the world and lose his direction." So I think that gives you kind of a sense that there was some kind of tension at this meeting. And we're going to explore that this morning. We're not going to, that will be one of the topics we'll explore to kind of get a better understanding of what really happened. And 3 of our panelists were there. And so we'll be I'll be turning to them to kind of ask for their perspectives. But we're not just going to focus on that. We're also going to talk about the work of APEC and how it really helps to advance emerging and potentially divisive or controversial issues, such as digital trade and issues associated with the digital economy and the 4th industrial economic revolution. We will look forward and talk about what other issues will and should be put on APEC's agenda by our business panelists, and our Chilean colleague, Matthias, will help explain and describe the priorities for Chile in its host year this year. And again, we'll talk about how APEC fits into the overall picture of Asia-Pacific economic relationships and growing economic trends and really growing uncertainty in the region as well. So to discuss these issues and questions, let me just quickly introduce the panelists. I think you all have their bios in front of you, so I'll be very short. First, I'm delighted to introduce the Honorable Ambassador Matt Matthews. He's been the U.S. ambassador and senior official to APEC over the past 3.5 years, which is a longer stint than most senior officials. So I think he brings a really interesting perspective, having worked on, I think you've been at 4 leaders meetings, yes, if I counted correctly, this morning. And we're also thrilled, and congratulations to you, because you have just been confirmed as the next U.S. ambassador to Brunei. I had the honor of working with Matt during, I guess, the Philippines year, the first year, and it was just a real pleasure, and so I really look forward to your comments. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Matias Ignacio Pinto Pimentel. He is the head of the Economic Department and Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Chile. And you really have an impressive career working both on trade and the environment, and we're really looking forward to hearing more from you. From the business side, I'm delighted that Monica Whaley could join us. She's no stranger to this stage, and she's no stranger to APEC. She's what I would call as kind of the glue behind the U.S. business participation in APEC, and really a pillar of expertise for the government delegations, because she's been with APEC since day one. She's the president of the National Center for APEC, which is located in lovely Seattle. And my understanding is NC APEC is going to be celebrating their 25th anniversary this year.
Very excited.
And finally, Phil O'Reilly, to my left. He serves, again, I mentioned earlier, as one of New Zealand's 3 appointed representatives to ABAC, and he serves a similar business advisory role at the OECD in Paris. And in your spare time, I understand you're the managing director of Iron Dukes Partners. So let's just get right into the program. I'll start and ask some questions, but then we're going to open this up to others. So start thinking of what questions come to your mind. So I thought we would just start with the first question, and that is, let's talk a little about what happened in Papua New Guinea. And I would be interested in your perspectives on why, first of all, if you can explain to the group, and maybe Matt, you can explain to the group, why these joint statements are important and what they are, and then we can talk a bit about people's perspectives on why the 21 governments were unable to agree to a joint statement this year.
Sure. So thank you, Wendy. Joint statements coming out of ministerial meetings in APEC or the Leaders' Declaration, they're useful because they help provide guidance for ongoing work. It shows a signal of ongoing commitment to the work that we do in APEC, pretty much across our major work streams. As I think Wendy pointed out, the focus of APEC has always been on free and open trade and investment in the Asia Pacific and working towards that goal. It's an ongoing goal. The Bulwark goals were set, I guess, in 1994, and we've been working on them ever since. That goal was supposed to be attained by 2020. We will fall short of it. So we continue to work, though, assiduously towards that effort. And all 21 economies now are in a process that works across a large array of issues, but it focused on reducing barriers to trade and investment and working with the private sector to inform how we go about doing that, how to identify what barriers are important to address, how to go about coming up with best practices for grappling with them, because there's a large variety of differentiation among our economies, and there will be different ways in which they try to achieve it, but we know what we're trying to achieve. So we're not really prescriptive in saying this is exactly how you have to do it, but we try to develop the principles of what we're trying to achieve, and then each economy goes back and tries to make that work. So the leaders' statements and the ministerial statements help provide that extra little bit of oomph to keep all the working processes of APEC going and keeping people pushing towards those same fundamental goals. What I would say, and it's important to understand, is that the work of APEC is a year-round process. We're doing working level meetings all through the year. There are senior level meetings among officials and various groupings all through the year, and we're pushing on the actual effort of gaining clarity on how we can go about removing barriers on an all-year basis. So it gets summed up during the leaders' meeting, and a lot of attention comes to APEC only during the leaders' meeting because you have 21 leaders from 21 economies. But that work progress, it's an ongoing thing. And it's really important to understand that because When we talk about APEC being consensus-based and non-binding, but it's a bottom-up operation. It's not so much a top-down operation. The real work, it takes place among experts, among business leaders, among governmental experts. And that process is, that discussion, those discussions go on all year long. But what we look for is a bit of a blessing from leaders at the end of a year to say, yeah, those were good accomplishments. Let's keep working on those things. And by the way, here's a couple of new topics. That's really the structure of the way it works. And what's important here, because what's unique about APEC is it is non-binding. And the crazy shirts that everyone seems to pay attention to, that actually should be an indicator, a positive indicator, because what it's telling you is that APEC has always tried to be a little less formal. Why? Because we're trying to be creative. We're trying to be open to new ideas. We're trying to step away from formalistic government positions and opening it up for real discussion so that there can be, we shed a little more light on issues and gain a little flexibility that allows us to say, well, maybe that will work. Maybe we'll give it a try. We do a lot of trial and error in the discussions that we have in APEC. By the time we get to best principles that have consensus, that's through a process of persuasion. It's just a persuasion through open discussion. People come to an agreement that, yes, this particular policy makes sense. You know, well, ongoing project for discussion is, should we have free flow of data across borders for the internet? There's still ongoing discussion. General perception is the digital economy can only really grow robustly if that's the case. Others are concerned, they have regulatory concerns, et cetera. We're continuing to work on that. But for trade facilitation, an area where all economies came to an agreement and all economies signed on to do it and all economies are implementing it, and they've actually reduced the cost of doing business as a result of implementing trade facilitation measures. That was a process of everyone saying, here's a way we can do things better. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to grow our economies a little faster. We're trying to spread the benefits of trade broadly, more broadly through our economy. And we're trying to encourage more people to enter into the benefits of trade within all of our economies. And we do that in a more creative environment by being a little less formal. That's it.
Okay, well, you put a good spin on the shirts.
Oh, yeah.
It took you 3.5 years to
I
come
bought
up
it.
with that talking point.
I bought into the shirts.
Okay. All right, so let's just go back to the statement again.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the statement negotiation didn't break down over the work program. It broke down over who had unfair trade practices, or we're talking about the multilateral trading system, where we're talking about protectionism, et cetera. So I just want to put that on the table. Phil, maybe I can turn to you, because you were at the CEO Summit. You heard both the Vice President's speech as well as Xi Jinping's speech, and probably were pretty close to what was going on during the week. How would you describe you know, the manifestation of the U.S.-China trade dispute in the APEC meetings this year? Was it overblown? Was it overstated? Or, you know, was it something that everyone was feeling?
Well, it was interesting it's useful to picture the room. You're on a cruise ship, actually, this year. We were on because the hotels weren't big enough for us. So picture that. It was quite a small room, maybe 300 CEOs or business people in the room. As usual with these kinds of meetings, a large contingent of Chinese business people. That's often the case, and a smattering of others. And really quite a charged atmosphere. The morning it started with a speech by the Prime Minister of Australia, then we had the Prime Minister of Malaysia straight after, then we had Medvedev from Russia straight after, then we had Xi, then we had Pence. So, you know, you really saw a lead forward in terms of the main course, if you like. The way in which these things tend to work is what you hope is that the leaders will turn up and talk about APEC. That's what you hope. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they use it as an opportunity to talk about other things, and that's entirely fine, no problem. But what you saw with people like Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, really used it as an opportunity to talk about Australia's free trade credentials and so on. And so did Medvedev, by the way. It's an interesting speech, obviously, talking about Russian free trade. But they both used it as an opportunity to talk about the APEC agenda, effectively. Whereas Xi gave a speech that was much more, if you like, a standard Xi speech, a relatively lengthy, very structured sort of a speech, talked about, continued on themes that he continued on for some time. I've heard him speak 3 or 4 times now. to the point that that Wendy was making. He talked about China's connectedness to the world, the fact that they supported openness, and so on. He talked about China's place in the world, the Chinese view of the WTO, for example, particularly issues around developing country status and special and differentiated treatment. If you're a WTO fanatic, you'll see, you know what I mean. So he gave, but it was quite a, for him, it was quite an aggressive speech. To Wendy's point, he made some pretty pointed remarks that could only have been pointed at the United States. And the nature of these things, one of the things that was striking about the meeting, and we saw this in Vietnam last year when Vietnam was hosting APEC, there was an awful lot of cheerleading in the room, a lot of people clapping and carrying on and you know, thumping of feet and all that sort of stuff, lots of voices in the room. So he went off, and then Pence came on and really didn't give an APEC speech at all. It was a speech, as I say, there's no criticism, but he gave a speech that was very much a follow-on from the speech he'd given a couple of weeks earlier, where he'd made some quite, for those of you who study these things, he made some quite pointed criticisms of China. And he carried that on a little bit through this speech. What he said that was really interesting, I thought, particularly given the fact that we were in Papua New Guinea, and once again, picture this, was you drive through downtown Port Moresby, you will see an awful lot of Chinese flags, Chinese signs, because the Chinese are very much invested in physical infrastructure in Papua New Guinea. That's, you know, it's a big part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So Pence turned up and really talked a lot about the American view around aid to the Pacific, and later announced, of course, later that day announced some quite significant aid programs, including a new military base in Papua New Guinea, so elsewhere in the Pacific, in Manus, which he maintained was led by the Papua New Guinea government. So it was really quite a strong speech, and also a speech that was also marked by a lot of clapping and a lot of foot stomping and stuff. So lots of cheerleading on that side as well. So one of the more aggressive speeches I've ever heard by a politician, as a matter of fact, when he said what Wendy's just told you, he said, you know, the constricting belt and the one-way road, I turned to my colleague and said, gee, did he actually say that? That's an extraordinary thing to say. So quite pointed, quite aggressive language, I thought, from a very senior US politician. So one of the interesting things about what happened in that speech was that you saw some of that leak into the business audience later in the day. Now, what's really important about APEC, the business also makes a statement to APEC leaders, right? So we have 4 meetings a year of the APEC, the Business Advisory Council. Part of what we're doing is that we're attempting to assist the senior officials, Matt and his colleagues, around some of the policy work, but also we're leading into a statement to leaders as well. One of the critical issues about that business statement is that each year it's a consensus business statement. In other words, the business communities of APEC member economies, including China and the United States, agree to language that goes into that statement to leaders. And those statements are generally very strong, they're generally very pointed, they're generally very positive and constructive about the role that APEC might have out for the next few years. No different this year. We had a consensus statement that was quite strong, that I thought was quite a constructive statement, and that had been signed off by both, in this case, both the Chinese and the US business representatives to APEC. But even after the leaders had their little piece of verbal fisticuffs, if you like, in the room, you saw some of that leaking back into the business conversation later into the day, a little bit of cheerleading of some of the leaders or some of the arguments on either side. We wouldn't want to see that continue on too much, frankly. You want to get back to the knitting, really, at times like this where governments are having arguments. Really what you want is the business community staying firm to say, actually, here's what we want. We're not going to have these disagreements amongst ourselves. We actually want free trade. We want better investment rules. We want free movement of data. We want free movement of people. We want a lowering of tariff and trade barriers of one sort or another. So it was very important that we continue that work on, and we did, despite the fact that there were some issues. But it was a very remarkable, I must say, it was a very remarkable meeting and series of speeches, particularly when you put it in the context of the speakers that had taken place in the morning. Just a quick word to finish on the leader's statement. I think it's really important to understand a little bit about that leader's statement. I suspect one of the reasons it wasn't agreed was that it was Papua New Guinea. And I think if that meeting had been taking place in Japan, I think Prime Minister Abe would have demanded a statement. You know, he would have had some weight in that debate. But Papua New Guinea being the smallest and least developed economy in APEC, I don't think there was the weight that the government and the people of Papua New Guinea had to get us there. Bear in mind also that joint statements of one sort or another are pretty hard to get to around the world right now. If you're sitting in the G20 process, as I am, they're pretty tough to pull out. I mean, there was a joint statement coming out of Buenos Aires this year. Was a hard-fought statement. The OECD has not had an agreed statement coming out of the Ministerial Council meeting, which takes place in June each year. They've not had a joint statement for the last 2 years, and China is not in that room. Bear in mind, that's an American issue. The Americans are the ones that are standing in the way of a joint statement there. So when you get these kind of big kind of directional debates going on in the world, joint leader statements are often the victim. Certainly, even if you get them, they tend to be a bit beige. They tend to be a little bit grey, not particularly pointed, because it's quite hard to get the language. So make sure you put APEC in the context of some of the other stuff that's going on around the world.
Well, thanks for that. And Monica, you were there too. How did the U.S. business community view the developments in Papua New Guinea?
Well, I think there, first of all, was quite a strong U.S. business community presence in the meetings. As far as the business side goes, the CEO Summit, there were a number of U.S. companies who were sponsors of the CEO Summit. There was a number of U.S. executives who were present and active in all of these activities, which I think was a very strong, considering how hard it is to get to Papua New Guinea and how uncertain, frankly, before everybody got there, people were about what the situation would be, how we would move from place to place and that sort of thing. And I guess I wanted to start by saying, actually, Papua New Guinea, knowing, having been there a few times now, what they had to work with, they did a remarkable job, actually, with this very large international event that had quite a lot of media coverage. They had a few hiccups, of course, but so did we in Honolulu in 2011. So it's a very challenging undertaking to host APEC. It's a year-long event, but this final one brings together all of these pieces. And for the U.S. business community, they see this, especially this final meeting and the opportunity that leaders are there with business people. It's really a time to, as Ambassador Matthews said, to sort of set out the vision for the coming year of APEC. This is where you say, here's what we'd like to see. The APEC Business Advisory Council tees up, says this is all of this work that's going on in APEC currently is good, and here's our input to it, but here's where we really think you need to be going. And back in 2004, at Wendy's first meeting, the then Chilean chair of APEC was the one who first put the idea of a free trade area of the Asia Pacific on the table, and this was very new and challenging to officials, which hadn't been talking about that to that point. So the business community's role from APEC-wide is really to continue to challenge and continue to think ahead, continue to create sort of this test kitchen of ideas that APEC can try and again, as Ambassador Masters was saying, that they do a lot of sort of testing work and building consensus and building socialization of issues through these efforts, experimental efforts and things. So the U.S. business community that is present at those APEC meetings, especially in a place like Papua New Guinea, are the ones that have been involved consistently all along the process. And they're engaged throughout, going to senior officials meetings in May to talk about digital trade, or they're going to a meeting on standards and conformance subcommittee meetings, or something on privacy. So we have a great number of U.S. businesses that are members of the National Center for APEC that are engaged actively throughout this whole year of work. So I think they too saw the sort of the drama of Papua New Guinea and the leader's statement with a bit of a grain of salt, knowing that all of this other work is ongoing and that the challenges are not ones that were challenges to APEC as an institution. As we've mentioned, these conversations and these difficulties, these challenging discussions are happening globally in a lot of different fora amongst both finance ministers and trade ministers and leaders and prime ministers and presidents in all of these different parts of the world. So I think they definitely still see, and I think the important part of what I saw in Papua New Guinea was a strong, probably about 80 different companies from the U.S. that were part of this rather small group of the small total, and the commitment to the Asia Pacific, the commitment to business there, and that business, regardless of the tides of change of attitudes about trade and things, that the business community is very much invested for the long term in the Asia Pacific, and already are seeing a lot of companies that want to be in Santiago, in Chile with us this year as well, to keep driving that agenda forward, because the value is in that ongoing agenda. And right around the table here, I'm just point you out, Russell. As Russell King traveled to Papua New Guinea this year also to take part in a mining task force discussion. So we've got U.S. companies, and his company is Freeport McMoran, which has been a sponsor of the CEO Summit for many, many years. That is an example, and their CEO or Chief Operating Officer have come to these meetings in these remote places and represented in a way that the U.S. business community really is deeply engaged in APEC, and that is part of what I think keeps driving things forward too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Matthias now. So I hope you're not regretting, your government's not regretting its decision to host APEC
the
this
pressure
year.
is on us.
Yeah, got some pieces to pick up. So
Yeah,
we'd be interested in kind of your views on going into your year. What are your priorities, and how are, can you play a bridging role between the U.S. and China?
Well, definitely, but back into the joint statement, we need to understand that usually the APEC joint statement is a reflection of the spirit and the reputation of APEC as a consensus-based forum. And of course, not having a communique or a statement is a setback for APEC. But also, we can understand that this is an opportunity for Chile, for APEC, because this is not an isolated event. This is part of a process that the position are being souring, they're being diluting all over the past years, and it's time to evaluate, to assess what is happening in the region in different terms, like geopolitical, like the integration, strategic level. And we need to understand that having a joint statement is not anymore as a given. That was usually every year and in every different forum. And also we can think, Chile is trying to think positive, you can imagine. Also can be positive because we realize what are the main difficulties, the main point of content that we have now in APEC, and this the role of APEC in the multilateral trading system, and how we'll face this FTAAP. This is like the free trade area of Asia Pacific, and that's why Chile wants to to have a proactive approach on this issue, of course, because definitely we'll work for having a joint statement, and we want to bring back to life the APEC's original spirits and goal. In fact, I think they are been losing for the couple of years. This is a non-binding consensus-based forum for regional cooperation and integration, and taking that into consideration is the perfect forum that people can present their idea, can have an open dialogue, and in a non-binding manner. And that's why I think we need to come back to the basics. We need to have more dialogue, less like speech reading. Phil already said that usually what the President Xi Jinping stated was pretty much a continuation of other statements that are already said in different form. I think that if we bring back the spirit of APEC, and if we we come back to the basic, we are returning to dialogue. It will present different ideas in a non-binding manner with the companies there helping us. So I think, and I hope, that is opportunity for Chile.
Setbacks always lead to opportunities.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually, you can add your thing, and then I'm going to ask you a question too.
Good.
Since you're not going to be for the whole year, and probably not at the leaders' meeting, I assume, is there any parting advice you would give the Chile host this year in terms of what they should focus on, or what lessons have been learned by previous hosts?
I'm taking notes, huh?
Yeah. You'll be quizzed.
Well,
after.
first, let me just emphasize a point that Wendy made in passing, which is that when it came to the work of APEC during Papua New Guinea's year, there was broad agreement and consensus on the whole range of work programs, whether it's covering, trade, digital economy, forward-looking work there to make sure we maintain a free and open system, services work we're doing to reduce barriers and restrictiveness in the services sector across our economies, structural reform, the ease of doing business, the idea of finding ways to make sure that we reduce the regulatory barriers both inside countries and between to facilitate the flow of goods and services across borders and within economies to help make economies more efficient. Women's economic empowerment, the idea that we ensure that we try to get rid of any policy barriers or address cultural impediments to women entering and remaining in the workforce and being productive contributors to that. I think there's broad-based understanding of the need to work on all these areas at APEC. So for APEC, the challenge is to what degree do we want to be ambitious? To how ambitious do we want to be? The reason why we have a non-binding environment and consensus-based is we're trying to create an environment which people can undertake more ambitious efforts. Because at the end of the day, it's a unilateral decision by each and every economy to the extent to which they will try to inculcate the best practices that we come up with in APEC. And in this environment, the United States consistently is pushing for the most ambitious outcomes possible when it comes to services, when it comes to the digital economy, when it comes to working aggressively to remove barriers for women's economic empowerment. And so inside APEC, it's a decision of the challenge is to what extent can we be ambitious? And to understand that a little bit better, there's this issue of differentiation. Some economies are developed, some are in developing status, and their ability to undertake some of the work that would be required to really remove barriers is a little more burdensome for them, which is why we've always had technical cooperation. It's been a critical point of the way in which we operate, that when we're introducing something that's challenging, we offer ways in which folks can train up and understand more deeply what it would require for them to actually implement these kinds of movements and how those new procedures and approaches that would reduce bureaucratic red tape, for instance, would actually benefit their economies. We have all that in place. That in Papua New Guinea's year, I would say we came to consensus on what we wanted to achieve, what we achieved in Papua New Guinea, and what we want to achieve in the coming year. It's just a matter of how ambitious do you want to be. The United States always leans towards a stance of higher ambition. And when it comes to the Leaders' Declaration, all the elements that came out in the chair's statement, if you see it, on the work program were matters of consensus. So it was really only discussion over the multilateral trading system that caused a little bit of differentiation. And that's not actually done in APEC. That needs to be understood. But it gets referred to as a matter of course in the tradition of APEC statements.
So maybe I can offer a piece of advice then. Why not? I'm moderating. And that would be, maybe the statements going forward should just be on the actual work and not trying to opine on who's protectionist or who is unfair trading practices or, where the multilateral trading system's going. That if APEC's doing this great work, why not just issue a statement that captures that work? What do you think?
Well, I think there's ongoing discussions on how they want to approach that. That'll be an interesting set of decisions for Chile. But I think people can be rest assured that the work of APEC has not been undercut by the fact that we had to have a chair statement at the end of the day. And the United States was ready to sign on, actually, to the consensus statement that Papua New Guinea drafted. And again, as I said, we're committed to making sure that the culture of APEC remains open, that it remains creative, that it remains inclusive. And we'll continue to work to those goals.
Matthias says, has Chile then released their priorities for the year? Are there like buckets of priorities without going to a lot of detail, but maybe the general topics?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Well, Chile has 4 priorities this year. It's digital society, integration 4.0, women, SMEs, inclusive growth, and sustainable growth. On digital society, we would like to implement an action that offer a short-term gain and set the foundation for more challenging terminal progress. This is a little bit of technicism. We want to use, in fact, the Internet and Digital Economy Roadmap that we already have in APEC and work upon with the new governments agree on 2018. On women, SMEs, and inclusive growth, I think we need to increase the participation on women and in the economy. For Chile, that's critical. And we like to attract women, retain and promote talented women in areas and industries that are traditionally dominated by men, at least in Chile. It's like mining, it's energy, it's transportation. So at the end, we want to work toward to have an action plan that contribute to the empowerment of women in the region. And in SMEs, and that's is in correlation with what you state, that we need to make the people, to convey the people the importance of free trade, to convey the people that we are reaching of all levels of society. And for taking that in consideration, we are trying to promote the integration of SMEs in the international trade region, but working through the removing of trade barriers, simplifying regulation, improving actions, and strengthen the capability of SMEs. And of course, we need to increase the education and the promotion, the certification, and all this training base for SMEs. I think that's what is going to be very important part of the work that we'll have in Chile. Well, integration 4.0, I think is a little bit related with all the priorities because it's trying to take into consideration that we are not facing the 21st century, the fourth industrial revolution, and we need to have a more comprehensive, not only regulation, but also infrastructure for reaching the digital area. So we are, but how we approach that from an APEC perspective, from a Chile-based perspective, we'll put effort in global value change and custom and border management, optimization, skill mobility. I think that's very important for APEC region, especially under this circumstance, and trade facilitation and working with a smart border and smart logistic and intelligence trade. And finally, is sustainable growth. Chile will focus on the protection of the ocean. This is a national priority since a couple of years, and President Piñera introduced, in fact, this priority himself. And we want to work in a pilot project for monitoring, in fact, marine debris or marine garbage. That is marine debris is the technical word, but it's garbage at the end that we have in the ocean. And we want to advance to having a global standard or regional standard on that manner. Also, we would like to promote the commercialization of products without mercury added. Also, on the sustainable growth priority, we would like to give a deep focus on sustainable energy. Having a cheaper, clear energy impact directly not only economy, but also society itself, the environment, of course, and we would like to intensify the work in electromobility. In fact, in Chile right now, we're moving in a very fast-paced, I think, to having a public transportation electric bus, like we are changing our traditional bus for electric bus. So probably in a couple of years we already have a pilot that for 90 buses in Santiago itself, and then we're taking small steps. And then, and finally, we'll work towards smart city and sharing, of course, best practices, integrated system services, harmonizing system, and at the end, sustainable urban infrastructure. That's the fourth priority.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to offer one more piece of advice, having worked on the U.S. host year in 2011, and that is, I think we started the year with 4 buckets as well, with a lot of priorities under each one. And I think, you know, by the first quarter of the year, we found it necessary to really like hone in on 1 or 2 things under each bucket, or you end up kind of not, you have so many priorities that you know, it's hard to really have deliverables at the end of the year. But that's just my 2 cents. Monica, you're nodding your head. Does business agree with that list, or do you have other things?
Well, no, I think the businesses, what I like about what Chile has done, first of all, they've been in conversation with the business community over the past probably year and a half that they've known that they were going to be chairing APEC, and they were thinking about what should our priorities be. And they've done a lot of talking both to the other economies and in the business and government side. So they've put a lot of thought into this, and I think that what they've chosen really weaves together nicely a lot of the different things APEC has been working on and making progress on in this kind of ongoing way. One of the things I wanted to point out that I'm so glad that Matthias pointed out was when they talk about inclusion and inclusive growth and the way that technology can enable that and foster that, one of the things that is important also as a pairing to that are the things in trade facilitation, which can put everybody to sleep if we decided to just really talk about customs and things like that. But it's so important for small businesses to be able to have those kinds of facilitations that allow them to do business on the internet. It's opened up a whole new world for people, but how many people know how to fill out a bill of lading, or, you know, that know what to do there? When people say that free trade and this issue of trying to liberalize trade is really only for big corporations, they're the only ones that really benefit from this, the people like, you know, Boeing and Caterpillar. You know, really, those, you know, Boeing and Caterpillar, they have plenty of people that can figure out trade laws and how to work them and how to fill out bills of lading. It's the smaller companies that really take it, you know, are getting the advantage of making things simpler and more efficient and clearer. And one of the things that APEC has done over the last several years in this area is try to move all of the APEC economies as far forward as they can move on the World Bank's ease of doing business list. I mean, this is a kind of numeric thing. I've moved from number 88 to number 47, and these are, you know, very tangible kinds of advances. But those advances are not just for the huge, you know, multilateral corporations. That really where they impact are the small and medium enterprises throughout the countries, and the internet then has made a lot of that possible. And I think that it's nice the way that Chile has really married those things together in their priorities.
Bill, do you want to comment on
I completely agree. And so if you want to make trade more inclusive, which is what we should all be wanting to do, the primary way you would do that in the next few years is to increase the participation of women, other underrepresented groups such as migrants, those in rural communities, for example, and SMEs, micro businesses in particular, into trade. And the main way you would do that is online. Frankly, they're not going to fill a container full of stuff, generally speaking. They're going to go online and sell something through Alibaba or through eBay or whatever it might be. So to Monica's point and Matthias's point, it's very, very important you get those quite boring trade rules right. Otherwise, you're simply not going to be able to go across borders, and there's not much of an opportunity for them to spend a lot of time trying to work through the kind of mud and the difficulty of unclear rules. Another point I'd make to the Chilean priorities this year is oceans policy. That's quite an interesting thing. It's surprising, really. APEC is, of course, the Pacific. It's a big ocean out there. It's not close to you, but it's very close to me. In fact, I can taste it on my tongue every day as I go to work if it's a bit windy in Wellington. The fact that we can think about oceans policy is a good example of a country in a host year introducing a new idea to the table. And whether that it is just a Chilean thing, who knows? Malaysia's the country after Chile, then it's us, then it's New Zealand in 2021. So whether that becomes a part of the ongoing conversation at APEC or not will be down to whether or not this voluntary thing that Matt talked about, down to whether or not other countries pick that up, and there's some value in that conversation that's over and above the value that you might see from other organizations dealing in oceans policy. But you can see that it's a good example of the value of different countries hosting it every year, that they bring their own ideas to the table. Last year, of course, Papua New Guinea, small matter of mining there. It's a big issue in Papua New Guinea, of course, massive mines and drilling for oil and gas. So they brought that to the table. They said, how can we make mining and oil and gas exploration a more valuable thing for the Asia-Pacific region? So each country each year brings something to the table. That's very valuable. Business supports that.
Touch on one more topic, and then we'll open the floor up for questions, and that is the topic of the possibility of expanding membership of APEC going forward. The Asia Society Policy Institute, about a couple of years ago now, we published a paper as a result of work done by the president of the Institute, Kevin Rudd, with others in the region, about the importance of APEC allowing India to join APEC. This is a quite controversial subject in Washington. If you get trade folks in a room with, the foreign policy types, they're completely different views on whether India should join or not. I don't think right now we want to have that discussion here, but can we just take a step back? I mean, APEC now has had 21 members for at least, I don't know when the last members were added, maybe 10 years ago? Or
1998.
1998, okay. So no new members have been added. It's interesting, the ASEAN countries, not all the ASEAN countries are in APEC. I know some of the countries in your neighborhood, Matthias, particularly Colombia and Costa Rica, have been interested. I mean, is it time to start thinking about adding new members? And, what are the challenges of adding new members? And, I don't know who wants to take the question, but let's kind of keep it.
Let me start.
Yeah, okay.
I think the chances of India joining anytime soon are zero for a whole bunch of reasons. The American.
Tell us what you really think.
The American government. Yeah, I just thought I'm a business guy. I don't have to be diplomatic. The U.S. government talks about the Indo-Pacific. I should just make the point, no one else does. No one else uses that phrase. So if that phrase takes off somewhere, that'll be good. But right now, everybody talks about Asia-Pacific. So if you were to expand the membership of APEC, I think, to your point, Wendy, there'd be some other more obvious candidates in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and in Latin America before you thought that would be much more logical before you thought about expanding membership to the likes of India or, say, Myanmar or those sorts of countries in the Indian Ocean. So the other point I'd make is that when you're going through tough times, as the multilateral system is right now, and as APEC is for obvious reasons, the lack of a leader statement being a good example of it, that's a time, I think, to stick to the knitting. That's a time to really double down on your core strengths and do the things that you're famous for really, really well, and I don't think that's conducive to it expanding membership, particularly into the Indian Ocean just yet. But there are other ways of potentially reaching out to some of those countries. You could involve them in some of the meetings. You could involve them as an observer, or you can involve them in some of the technical cooperation activities. The OECD, with which I'm involved, is doing a bunch of that. In a week or two's time, we'll be in Kazakhstan, of all places, helping them on a bit of technical cooperation around OECD matters. So it's possible to engage in that way, but my sense is right now the chance of APEC expanding membership formally is pretty much zero for the next few years.
Let me just add a couple of comments. I think the key there, first of all, there was a moratorium on new members from 1998 to 2010. The moratorium expired, but leaders have never expressed an interest in actually expanding membership in any broad sense. And it's a complicated process, but if you were going to think about it, what you would want, because APEC is a consensus-based organization, you need to bring like-minded new members in, those who share a commitment to the work that APEC has been doing, to the policy achievements that APEC has made, and that it wants to do. That really those economies would have to be economies that are committed to truly free and open trade and investment and to moving forward to achieve that. India presents a particular problem because it has a mercantilist trade policy, and it's actually been going in reverse in many respects over the last couple of years. So it makes it even a more difficult challenge, even if we were going to be able to begin a process of serious consideration of expansion of membership. But we're just not there on that. And if there were, there would be better candidates like Colombia that are, as a member of the Pacific Alliance, is committed to in a broad way to the fundamental precepts that drive APEC. But you won't get a serious set of discussions on this until there is a sense that it's essential to do it, and that it can be done in a constructive way that preserves APEC's ability to move forward on policy in an ambitious and effective way, a way that actually leads in the global community, just as we've done on trade facilitation, environmental goods, and a number of other areas where we set a standard. So people have to want to be in the lead and pushing themselves to achieve those things faster than other economies. That would be the underlying principle in which you'd have that kind of conversation, but we're just not there.
Quickly, I would just add that the 21 economies of APEC are already amongst the most diverse group in the world. If you brought them together, you say, Brunei and Papua New Guinea and the U.S. and China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore, and you've got, Vietnam. They're such different places, and to think it's really kind of astounding and amazing and a very good thing that they do have this already agreed series of things that Ambassador Matthews just talked about. That they've got a common goal and a common set of programs, different ideas about how they should be implemented and how fast, but the fact that you've got these 21 already on the same page on a lot of these very ambitious ideas, it's hard to imagine others coming in, as Ambassador Matthews well said, that that aren't already bought in 100% on the agenda and the goal that's common.
Picking that up this year?
Yeah. Well, as Ambassador Matthews said, the moratorium expired like 9-10 years ago, and the membership hasn't changed. But we believe that APEC membership, expanded or not, should not be an impediment, in fact, to engage with others' economy, be them by bloc of like Pacific Alliance, European Union, or with a specific economy. And we think that this type of engagement will not dilute the effectiveness and the work that we are doing in APEC, and in fact could increase our relevance around the world. But if augmenting the membership will drive to APEC to a stalemate, Chile's in the view that it's better to stay as it is at this moment.
Thank you. How about we open up the floor? I'd be glad to take any questions. Yeah, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Charlie
Can I
Kimball.
just ask you, can you please just introduce yourself?
I was about to.
Yeah.
I'm Charlie Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance, and I'm wondering if there's a difference in the view of between the business community and the ambassadorial community of the increasing militarization of the South China Sea, and in particular, if there's a reaction as to why a week ago or so Xi Jinping talked about the need for one China to be implemented. This has been a policy for decades. Why did he bring it up last week?
Okay, other questions? Let's take a few. Yes.
Yeah, my name's Kevin Shanley of the Asian Society Policy Institute. And I was interested in the reception that VP Pence's speech got, because he had long since telegraphed that speech at the Hudson Institute, in which he brought up the questions of intellectual property rights and technology transfer. My question is simply this: how much time was spent on those 2 points, particularly the second one, technology transfer, which I think business would be very concerned with? How much time was spent in your meetings in Papua New Guinea discussing those two issues?
Other questions? Let's take a few. Yes?
Ken Wasserman, I'm an attorney. What specifically, if anything, has APEC said concerning the assistance of developed countries to more emerging market economies?
Okay. One more? Yes.
My name is Zahava Roden, and I'm a member of the Asia Society. And my question is actually for Mr. Pinto. Since APEC has great plans for Chile, I want to know what are they planning for the Isla de Pascua, which is part of the economy of Chile.
Okay, so we have a number of questions here. Why don't I...
Couple.
Okay.
For Mr. Kimball, key thing about APEC to remember is we are completely focused on economic policy. We don't get into geostrategic issues. We're focused on economic policy for a purpose. It's our comparative advantage to be focused there and to be non-political. And APEC commits itself to doing that. And so whether it's South China Sea or One China policy, we just don't get into those issues. And it's by intention. The goal is to get stuff done by focusing strictly on economic policy issues. When it comes to the issues of IPR, there is an IPR track in APEC. Technology transfer has not really been an issue, I think, of discussion, frankly, but IPR and IPR protection as a core kind of element of a good investment environment, one that will foster development faster, has been an issue in APEC and will continue to be so. And last but not least, development assistance. Well, APEC is not a development assistance organization. It's focused on the supposition that free and open trade and investment will drive growth and prosperity in the region, and we focus on that. And again, it's an issue of comparative advantage. We try to have that focus. We let development agencies within the World Bank, UNDP, focus on the development side of stuff. But what we always have had was capacity building. And developed economies within APEC do provide that. And the United States does that to the tune of around 4 million every year. And it's directed at pushing forward on programmatic work that we've all agreed to do in APEC. And I think that's actually been very helpful. But it's got to be targeted to the effort of creating the right policy settings for trade and investment that will actually spur growth and create jobs.
Just to very briefly follow on from Matt, is business concerned about militarization in the South China Sea? Of course we are, because a lot of trade goes through there, but it's not a matter that's discussed at APEC for the reasons that Matt talks about. We talk about it elsewhere. The Pence speech and the question of IPR and technology transfer, those matters are discussed inside ABAC. Of course, we talk about those matters around the table, and but what we try to do when we're having those kinds of conversations is talk about a constructive way forward rather than having a bit of a moan session about what's going on. So to Matt's point, we would put the technology transfer issue in the context of free and open trade on the one hand, and in the context of intellectual property rights on the other. In other words, we would try to have a conversation that would be a more constructive go-forward conversation around the structures you would put in place to ensure that technology transfer was taking place in an agreed fashion through agreed trade rules and in an agreed IP situation where everybody can understand what was going on. Of course, there are some of the tensions that go on from time to time in those kinds of issues. Yes, of course, they do bubble up occasionally, both in the formal meetings and in the informal meetings, the informal cups of coffee and so on, which is so important in these kinds of events and processes. But we'll largely try and put those conversations in a foundation of how might we move forward and make recommendations to officials and leaders on that basis. I'm really looking forward to Matthias's Chilean answer, though.
I would just add on that too. I mean, one thing APEC, at least when I worked on it, I thought was really good is trying to educate countries why certain restrictions are not in their interest, and how by putting into place something like, very prohibitive technology transfer practices or, data localization requirements, how that affects your ability to innovate, how that affects your ability to attract foreign direct investment. And so I think that arm of APEC is very strong, and I'm sure those conversations are taking place.
I would only add, and I also want to hear the Chilean answer, because I'm going to learn something new today, that's for sure. The other piece of it, though, I think it is important that APEC exists, and they talked about this in 1993, that at that point, it was really the only place where leaders got together, and the proposal that they do so annually was a new idea at the time. And I think having those kinds of structures in place where you know you're going to have a meeting, it's not setting up a big state visit or bilateral, it's, you know that you're going to be able to have coffee on the sidelines. And I think it's been important both between the government and leaders as well as between the business folks. So I remember back, I forget which year it was, but Madeleine Albright was our secretary, and there was a subgroup that sort of met for coffee on the issue of East Timor at the time. And there was a crisis, they were able to discuss it on the sides, but this ability to do things in a way that's a little bit more informal, a little bit more, and certainly the context of what's happening in the world at the time is not lost on everybody who comes to APEC. And so I don't know what all conversations happen over the tea and coffee settings, but I know that there are a lot of them, and we appreciate them.
Well, I think it's good that everybody understands that this forum has some very specifics and very particular approach. It's a non-binding, it's a consensus base, it's non-binding, and we don't differentiate country between developed and developing country. Development country is pretty much a discussions between the around all the United Nations forums. Like if you go of UNCCC, you have this discussion. You go to the WTO, you have this type of discussion that can be very hard. In fact, and is the core is in the core of the discussion. Is part of the core of this forum. We don't have this in APEC. And we are glad that because we are equal, but of course we are different. We have different state of development, and we need to approach that from a different perspective instead of having differentiation. I think that's very important. And of course this technical work, the capacity building that pretty much, for being completely honest, is done and is being supported by developed country in a traditional way, is part of the how we face this challenge in the different economy. Regarding the question of Easter Island, well, Easter Island is I think probably is the most isolated island in the world. Is 4,000 kilometers on the west coast, east coast of Chile. Is like 5 hours to arrive to airplane, and then you have a pretty much small island that pretty much I think everybody knows because it has the moais on, and I was quite impressed that not many people know that it's Chilean, in fact. and the moai and Easter Island is pretty much is a native, is Chilean native people living there. And so it's my understanding that we don't have any meetings there, but it's taken into consideration in two areas, in fact. Inclusive growth, because we are now dealing like inclusive growth, including, of course, natives, is very important, in fact, from the political agenda of the administration of President Piñera. And we'll work specific on the oceans, because of course it's an island. We'll work on a specific the marine debris and the economics on that part of their concern. In fact,
I hope to visit.
Any further?
I hope to visit.
You're welcome to visit. In fact.
Yeah, Lulu. I want to introduce Lulu Wang, one of our trustees, and also Denise Saul sitting next to her too. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Delighted to be here. I wonder if, Matthias, if you could, thank you for offering the list of topics you really want to explore at your gathering. And I wonder if of the 4 or 5 that you listed, which 1 or 2 are you most hopeful will be advanced after the next conference. And I wonder if other panelists might weigh in and join him in terms of where you think most progress can be made among these topics. Thank you.
Okay. Well, this is my personal opinion. No. Of course, Chile will work and will push all the 4 priorities, but and in fact, they try to have a specific delivery for each for each of the priority. But if you compare like integration 4.0, it's more a broader. It's like, okay, this is the for revolution, how APEC faced the 21st century, and it's taking into consideration that the vision of APEC post-2020. But it's more broader. If you think on women, SMEs, inclusive growth, you can have more specific issues. Like we will have a working plan on women. We want to work to, I don't know, reducing trade barriers. You have more tangible issue. You have more deliverers that is more easy to have. I think the integration 4.0 or work on a smart city pretty much is less tangible for working, and especially as a negotiator.
I'd hope from a business perspective that, and this is already going on to some extent, but the work around inclusive trade, inclusive growth, I think is really, really important. If you think about one of the big things that's been going on in some parts of the world, not all parts of the world, it's important to understand, has been an increasing distrust of globalization and of trade, of course, very importantly in this country. But as I say, not in all countries. It's very important to understand. Many countries inside the APEC membership, there is no lack of consensus. The consensus is that trade and openness is a good thing, and off we go. But you can see that that's causing some real tension around the world where you do have these disagreements. So the way to make trade more inclusive is to get more trade to more people, in my view, and that would necessarily include micro, small and medium enterprises, women, indigenous people, important in my country as in Chile. So the idea of being able to take that conversation forward in an APEC frame is really important. I think it's because if you think about the multilateral that's in the most trouble around the world right now, well, that's the WTO. So if we can, through APEC, build out that inclusive frame, that idea that trade does work for all, it's demonstrably true, and let's make that even clearer, then I think we'll help unglue some of those other multilateral conversations going on around the world. So that would be my hope.
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention a couple of specific things. We talked about digital economy being a core area of work for Chile. There we've got ongoing work in cross-border privacy rules, which will help small businesses by having a system in place that provides needed regulatory oversight, but privacy for the users themselves. These are the things that can help small businesses as well as large. We've got digital building blocks. This is a set of best practices we're working on. Hopefully we can get to a positive conclusion on that. And again, that will help set the framework in which each economy, assuming we do get consensus, will ensure that they keep a system open and functional that allows not only large businesses but small businesses to participate. One way we're doing this practically in APEC is we've moved for best practices in online dispute resolution. So because one problem for small firms is if they run into a problem on a deal, a transaction, and how do they get restitution? How do they get a solution that doesn't raise their cost? And the easiest way, of course, and the lowest cost way is to go through online dispute resolution. If we can have agreement among all of our economies, then we know small businesses in our economies can trade with all the other economies, knowing that there's solutions. So there's cross-border privacy rules to help smooth the path for ensuring there's a consistent way of providing insurance for your customers, and online dispute resolution to make sure that the payment process or failure to make payments can be resolved at a low cost and efficient way. All these kinds of things are the pragmatic ways in which we do things. I often describe APEC as, we're like 21 teams of grease monkeys working on a high-performance vehicle. And what we do is not sexy, but what we're trying to do is to get that machine to run smoother, faster, more efficiently, and more effectively. And if we do our job right, the outcome can be pretty exciting, right? You get good outcomes for everybody. And it's these kind of detailed work efforts that lead to a better outcome. On services, of course, the key thing here that we've been working on for the past couple of years is to get agreement among APEC economies on a trade restrictiveness index for services, basically working off the OECD, but with some adjustments to meet the needs of APEC economies. But once we get that set of metrics in place, then each economy can use that and share data on what their barriers are, how they're going about reducing them. And if we can do that, again, it's an incremental process, one which we'd like to see come to a good solution by 2025, but it's this understanding that real inculcation of opening measures takes time, but if you give it the time, each economy will undertake to do those things and we'll be at a better place at the end of the day. And when it comes to women's economic participation, when we talk about inclusiveness, in APEC, the two major ways that we do this is reducing barriers or bureaucratic red tape that prevent small and medium enterprises from entering the global economy. And remember, about 95% of our firms tend to be small and medium enterprises. So if we can lower the cost by getting rid of that unnecessary red tape, making it faster to register a business, providing secure payment systems across borders, all the different kinds of things, pre-customs clearance for goods, everything that would reduce costs. If we can do all of those things, inherently, you're going to make it possible for more and more businesses across the breadth of your economy to participate and benefit. Women's economic participation, in the United States, the women's economic participation rate is somewhere around 66%, I think, and it hasn't gone higher in the last couple of decades. We have room to grow. In Chile, I think it's down in the 40s, and there's definitely room to grow there. And I think all of our economies understand that we can't maximize our growth potential. We can't maximize the benefits of the economy unless we have a higher percentage of women actually participating in our economies. And that means getting at those barriers, and we're committed to doing that. And I think we'll get something, because this year is the first year that any economy in APEC has made women's economic participation a priority agenda. This is something that Chile really needs to be recognized for, and all of us should deeply appreciate. It's a process that was set in place in 2011 when the United States hosted, and it's been an active work program ever since, but Chile is taking it to a new level.
So when we convene next year at this time, we'll assess whether progress is made on these issues, but these are really important issues.
One more thing to add on that. If you look at the trajectory of the next three hosts of APEC, after Chile comes Malaysia and then comes New Zealand, I think I would be very surprised if the women's economic empowerment and inclusiveness, along with the opportunities that the digital society offers for that goal, are not central to each of those three economies' themes. I think that's, and we'll look at probably different ways. In New Zealand, I would suspect that some of the more things on agriculture, the ways that the digital society is affecting rural communities that produce food, and different ways it produces food and moves it around, that will probably be a focus. In Malaysia, you might see more on health and medical kinds of things, and the way that the digital society is changing that and trying to bring in more people. So that just, as a trajectory, I think will shift a little bit, but I think those two elements will be central to the future hosts as well.
And perhaps we can conclude with that. I think, Monica, you've made a really good point that even though there's a different host each year for APEC and they have their priorities, there's a lot of merit to coming up with a work program that can be taken host by host, and they can build on the deliverables achieved in 1 year. Well, thank you, everyone, this morning for joining us, and please join me in giving a big hand of applause to our great panelists this morning.
Thank you. I would love to have all of it for staff, if
Okay.
that's possible.
Yeah, I'll go get some disposables from them.
Hi. Good to see you. Say hi to everyone. Oh, please do. Thank you. We didn't need it. It's always good to have something handy
Yeah.
in case.
It's always those events where we don't think about it, that
I know.
7 people want to
And
ask
the
the question.
thing